Hello, and it's great to have you with us today. I've just finished reading a book by Daniel Janosik on John of Damascus, the first apologist to Muslims. And I'm here with Daniel today to talk about his book. Hello, Daniel.
Hello, Samuel. It's good to be here. Thank you for inviting me and talking about my book.
It's great to have you with us. Thanks. Before we look at your book, can you please tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Well, I've been married for about 40 years to my wife, Ann, and we have one daughter who just had her third child. So she has one boy, and this is the second daughter, and they live about an hour and a half away. So we really treasure that relationship. I studied at several different universities. I got my MDiv and a master's in Islamic studies or Muslim studies at Columbia International University, which is well known for missions. And I taught there for a while. I still do adjunct work there. And then I got my PhD through London School of Theology, where I had Tony Lane for my theology part, who was very good with theology and the church fathers and history of Christianity. And then I had Peter Riddell, who was the director of the Islamic program there at London School of Theology, and then he went on to Melbourne. But he is one of the experts in this field, and it was a treasure to have two mentors who knew this material so much. Right now, I teach in 4 seminaries as an adjunct, and I enjoy teaching on Islam, apologetics, and world religions. And I get to teach with a colleague named Dr. Jay Smith, and we do a lot on Islam. And that's especially at Veritas Seminary, but I also teach at Southern Evangelical Seminary, Columbia International University, and Erskine Seminary. So I love teaching, I love researching, and I love the subject of dealing with Islam.
Okay. Well, I look forward to sharing with you and with everyone else what you've written about John of Damascus. Now, before we look at John of Damascus, John of Damascus is one of the fathers of the church. Can you tell us a little bit about the fathers of the church for those who may not have heard about them much before?
Well, the fathers of the church were from after the apostolic age. You had all of those who were involved in developing the theology, the doctrines, arguing all the different controversies through, so that we could come up with what actually was from the Bible and from the Word of God. And so you have through the ages, and they started, as I said, after the apostolic age, after the apostles died, so late first century, and all the way on to John of Damascus in the 8th century, and he was the last of the church fathers.
Okay.
So he kind of capped it all off. But these were the theologians who developed what we believe today. In fact, the first chapter of the book is all on dealing with the development of the Trinity through controversy. Because, of course, we know the word Trinity is not in the Bible, but the concept of the Trinity is all the way through, from Genesis all the way through to the end of the New Testament. So these experts in theology were the ones who developed the understanding that we have today. And they were tremendous. They are well worth reading today. In fact, they give so much substance to theology and the development of what we believe that is well worth the time to take the deep dive.
Yeah. And so you're saying that John of Damascus is the last of these?
Yes. So, and that's partially because of the way that after his time, of course, he was in the Byzantine area, the Eastern Church, the Eastern Orthodox Church, And then you had, well, the development of many other things, but you had more of the Roman Church taking over a lot of the historical parts that we know of, because we follow the Western traditions more than the Eastern traditions in the countries where we live. But yes, he was the last, and he wrote on a number of very important issues. In fact, the subtitle of my book deals with the Trinity, and he was one. His famous writing, Orthodox Faith, is one where he summarized the theology of these 7 centuries of these church fathers. And he did a marvelous job on the Trinity. And in my book, I have one of the most exhaustive treatments of the Trinity, according to John, that you would find in books today. So if you're interested in the Trinity, and especially things like the perichoretical understanding of God, that is the circle dance, the interrelationship between the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, John does a fascinating job on that. So I recommend that to you as well.
Okay. Can you tell us a little bit about when and where John lived?
Okay. John, of course, John of Damascus, lived in Damascus, Syria. He was born around 675, and he died around 750, 749, 750. So he lived about 75 years, and he was right there when Islam started up, even before it was Islam. But and he was in a favorable position. His grandfather was actually the mayor of Damascus when in 635 these Arabs came up and took it over, and his grandfather was known as surrendering the city in order to gain peace, so nobody would be killed. So he did that. And his grandfather and his father were both what they call the logothetes. They were the chief tax collectors. And John inherited that position under Abd-al-Malik, who was probably the most powerful caliph at that time, and probably the one who really started Islam, as we will perhaps find out more about later.
Okay. Well, look, I like to now get into your book. In your book, you cover many things about John, the sources on his life and various things. And I'm just going to go through some of these chapters now, and we'll look at some of the issues that you cover. Mm-hmm. Now, in chapter 1, you write that Christian teaching needs to be recontextualized for each generation. What do you mean by that?
Well, basically, we keep on coming up with new heresies that are often the old heresies, and they come in a different shape and form, and we need to train Christians to be able to understand what's going on so that they can defend what they believe and refute the error. And there's a lot of error, so it's recontextualized. Like today we have this new woke culture that is invading even the church, and we need to understand what's going on. But it's really a lot of old things that are coming to fruition again, and so it's very important to recontextualize so that we can deal adequately, more than adequately. For example, in the book, again, the first chapter is on the development of the Trinity through controversy, and it took a number of centuries, really. Of course, you get to the Council of Nicaea, and they are dealing with the Trinity at that time, thanks to Athanasius, one of the other church fathers, and his good arguments. But they had to hammer it out, and they had to recontextualize it in the different parts of the globe where they were, because the Latin church, basically dealing with Latin as their theological language, and then you had the Byzantine church dealing with the Bible as a Greek document, and there were differences because of the different languages. So there needed to be a contextualization in the different time periods.
Yeah, so in other words, the way that Christians express their faith will be influenced by the culture that they're in, and so they've got to be aware of that so they can express it faithfully. Is that sort of what you're saying?
Yes.
Yeah.
And I'll keep on bringing up these three terms: understand, defend, refute, because this was John's apologetic approach. And it just solidified my own understanding of those three terms. We need to understand what we believe so that we can speak faithfully to what we believe. But we also have to understand what, in this context, what Muslims believe, so that we can truly understand their questions. And then we need to be able to defend what we believe and then refute any error, because there is error in those religions that are opposed to Christianity. And if we are not able to do that, then we won't be able to win people over to Christ. And indeed, we will be sucked up into the maelstrom of all these other errors. So it's very important.
Yeah, and so with John, what you have happening is that the context of the Middle East has a big change to it, or a big addition, whereas before it was Greek philosophy, sort of Judaism and paganism. Now you've got Islam coming in, and that creates a new context for the Christians. Is that what you're saying? And John's learning how to speak in that context.
Very much so. And it is amazing when you think of it that within 100 years of the so-called death of Muhammad in 632, within 100 years, half of Christendom was taken over by this group, and then later pretty much subjugated under what became Islam. It's amazing that that would happen in such a short time. So people were not prepared. They did not understand what they believed. They were not able to defend it, and they were certainly not able to refute the error. So John had this burden, and he wrote his largest work, Orthodox Faith, to summarize all the theology and these church fathers for the, up to his time, so that the people, the Christians of his time, would have an understanding. And we need to do that today. We need to understand what we believe better.
Yes. And so what I'd like to do now is actually show people who may be watching this video where they can find John's books. So let me just go to here. So as we have mentioned before, John of Damascus is the last of the church fathers, and I took this photo in my university. They have the volumes of the church fathers here. There's actually 68 of them, so there's some more elsewhere. But that gives you an idea of the size. And one of these is St. John of Damascus. And you can see he has his own volume. And if you found the church fathers, you would find this, you would find John's volume there. So I'll come back to us now, but that's where you find John's writings.
Okay, one other thing about the Frederick Chase book that you just showed.
Yes.
It's a great book. He gives good translations, though he, as well as others who have translated especially what we'll call the Heresy of the Ishmaelites, the works of John on Islam. They worked from fewer manuscripts and they were not all there. And in my book, I translated from the critical text, where all the manuscripts were brought together. So I was able to correct certain mistakes that were made, or certain areas that did not have the information. But Frederick Chase's book is very good on showing a lot of the works of John. So that's an excellent book to have.
Yeah, great. Okay, so what I'd like to ask now is about John and his historical context. So this is in chapter 3. And you talk about knowing about John. How do we know about this man? And you say that his historical context comes from two main sources, from Islamic sources, but also from non-Muslim sources. You discuss about some of the issues and some of the problems with Islamic history from the time of John. Can you elaborate on that for us, please?
Mm-hmm. This is an exciting area in the field of Islamic studies from a Christian perspective, because for 1400 years we've been given this traditional Muslim narrative, or what Jay Smith likes to call SIN, the standard Islamic narrative. And it talks about Muhammad living at a certain time in Mecca, which is in the Hijaz of the middle part of Saudi Arabia, and the coming of the Quran to Muhammad, and all of these stories that Muslims take as factual. But what we realize now is that all of that was written down about 150 to 200 years later, after it would have happened. And the earliest sources for the Muslims would be in two narrative books, one written by Ibn Ishaq, who lived from 704 to 767. So before he died in 767, this is after John of Damascus died in 750. So you have the first biography of Muhammad coming about at that time, well over 100 and almost 150 years after Muhammad died. And that's where we would pick up what we would know about Muhammad. But even that book is lost. We don't have that book. What we have is a recension, or a compilation, supposedly, of this book by a man named Ibn Hisham, who died in 833. And he was from up north in the Persian area, Iraq. He would have written this book, and we have this book in different manuscripts, different pieces. But this is supposedly what was written by Ibn Ishaq, but we don't know. He could have made that up. But what I'm saying is that we don't have any written documents from Muslims for the first 150 to 200 years. And then we have the Hadith, we have all these stories, sayings of Muhammad. But when we look at the Hadith, and even many Muslims are realizing this, they are probably made up at a time when Islam was developing and splitting into different factions, and these factions and political groups had to have their own reason for believing what they did. And so this is where they think that these hadith, or these sayings of Muhammad, came about to support their own views. So that point taken, we don't have any earlier Muslim sources, but we do have a number of non-Muslim sources all the way back, the earliest parts of the 7th century, in the time that Muhammad supposedly lived. And we have little pieces of this and that from, people, the doctrine of Jacobi from 634, talking about a prophet in that area. Doesn't name Muhammad, but a prophet who is carrying a sword, going around with a sword, and therefore in battle. We have Sophronius from 639, who's in Jerusalem. He's the patriarch of Jerusalem, and this invading force, this force of Arabs. He doesn't call them Muslims. He doesn't. There would be the Saracens or Ishmaelites. Those were terms that were used of these Arabs, even by John a little bit later. But he talks about how they are godless, and how they mistreat the people. And yet, in other sources from that time, they talk about their leader rushing to build a little house of worship, which would be called the mosque. And of course, that would be the worship place for Muslims today. So you have these conflicting stories that we try to put together, but these are from non-Muslim sources and not from the Muslim sources themselves. So this is where we're still putting the picture together. John comes in as an eyewitness, and that's important because we have his work from that early time, within the first 100 years, and serving under the most powerful caliph at that time, when we believe that Islam really developed.
So in other words, you're saying that we've got non-Muslim Christian sources which are earlier than the earliest Islamic written sources. And so this, so what we find in John and the Christian sources actually contributes to how we learn about and how we can understand what was happening at that time and what Islam looked at before its own written history.
Yes, we have those documents, and they're very valuable. But we're also using new archaeological finds in that area, or things that are not found, because we haven't found any artifact in Mecca before 800. So that puts a big question mark there. So yes, these are the documents.
Yeah, and I just wanted to pick up on that point you were talking about, the hadiths, because this is something that I've found in my own work, where if you read the Quran, it says over a dozen times that Muhammad did not do miracles. Again and again, it's saying, give us a miracle, give us a miracle. And you'll say, well, that's up to Allah. No, it hasn't been given. And there is no miracle that's presented in the Quran. But yet when you read the hadith, Muhammad does loads of miracles. He's splitting the sun. He's having water pour out of his fingers. There's all these miracles. And so you really can't hold the Quran and the hadith together at that point, because it seems that the hadith are addressing maybe a challenge from Christians who are saying, why doesn't Muhammad have any miracles? And the Muslims don't have any miracles to give. And so it seems that the hadiths are written, centuries later to answer the objections of the Christians and the Jews, and provide some evidence for Muhammad doing miracles, even though this is against the Quran. So is that what you're saying about the hadiths, that we can see that they reflect a later development?
Yes, much later. Think of it this way. The hadith were written in the middle to the late 9th century, 800s. You have Bukhari around the 870, somewhere around then, is one of the earliest ones, where he supposedly went around and collected what was it, 250, over 200,000 of these hadith, and whittled them down to about 7,000. And even then, there were redundancies. But they're supposedly linked by what are called isnads, linking them back. We don't have those isnads. They're not in the earliest ones. It seems like they were all, perhaps when the Muslims tried to bring these forth as saying, well, Muhammad said this. Well, how do you know that? Do you have a text? Well, they didn't have a text. So they had to create this idea that, well, so-and-so said this, and it was picked up. So a colleague of Muhammad, one of his followers, heard him, and that was passed on to the next generation, to the next generation, and the next generation. We're talking about 5 generations or so, but we don't have any evidence of that.
Okay, well, look, we'll move on with your book. In chapter 5, you talk about the theological development of Islam, and this is part of what we were just discussing then. But and this comes back to where we started today. You were saying that in Christianity, when the gospel goes out, it initially goes out to the synagogues, and then from the synagogues starts to go out to more of the Greco-Roman world. And the theological context there, the context there was Judaism, pagan religions, and obviously Greek philosophy. That was a major way of how people thought. And so Christians had to express and proclaim their beliefs in that context of Judaism, pagan religions, and Greek philosophy. And that's what we read about in our church history. Obviously, Islam makes a new addition to that. They now have to express their faith in an Islamic world. But what about for the Muslims? What was the theological world like for the Muslims when the Arabs come out and they conquer the Christians? They come up and conquer everyone. What's the theological world that these early Arabs or Muslims are encountering? What are the issues that they're now facing that they didn't have before?
Okay, a lot of their theology was developed reflexively. And what I mean by that is that it seems like there were counter arguments that were brought up against what they were doing and what they were saying, and they had to figure out what they did believe. For example, one of the early controversies was works versus faith. Are we saved by our works, or are we saved by faith? This was something that Christians would have asked them, and they would have had to deal with. And you had two groups called the Kharijites and the Mujiites, and they talked about one group talked about human responsibility. It's all up to us. We've got to be good people. We've got to do good things, versus God's power, which is supposed to be His sovereign power, and He can do anything, and therefore He can give us mercy. So there was this idea: is it works or is it by faith? They were concerned whether their leaders would see paradise because of what they did. If they did something against Allah, would they see paradise? So this was one of the earliest controversies. Today, it's a settled thing. It really falls on the side of works, and the idea that God is absolute, but yet you have to follow the law. So there's a strong sense of having to do the duty, but there's also a sense of fatalism because you don't know whether you've done enough. And so some will follow that. Well, many of them follow that, the works. Others will say, well, I don't know. I'll just have to rest on the mercy of Allah, which really comes out of Christianity. It's a modern reflexive idea for the Muslims to take that on. But the general sense all through the centuries is that Islam is based on works. Another one was free will versus predestination. The Qadarites and the Mutazilites, they were the free thinkers of that time. We're talking about free will. We do have free will. The Jabarites or the traditionalists said, no, we are predestined. Everything is predestined, everything we do. And so again, there is a fatalism. And that's why they would say, inshallah, if anything happens, it's God's will. If somebody dies, inshallah. If a tornado comes through, inshallah. There's fatalism because they rejected the free will. They rejected the Mutazilites, who were trying to really deal with what the Christians, I think, were bringing up. And then the last one was whether the Quran was created or eternal. And we think, well, why is this a problem? Of course it's created. It's a book. But they believe that this word of Allah has to be eternal. But they say that the Quran is originally written on a tablet, a physical tablet in heaven. But that means that there's something else that is eternal other than Allah. And you can't have that. You can't have especially something material. And so that's going back and forth, and they'll express it in different ways. But these were the controversies. And I think, as in my research, it seemed like they were counter thoughts to what the Christians were pressing them into. And then you have Al-Ghazali coming along in the 12th century, early 12th century. And he was the great philosopher at that time. At first, he was what we call the Asharite, where he had kind of the middle ground. But then when he became a Sufi, he said, wait a minute, all these books of reason really take us astray from Allah. Reason is not good. Philosophy is not good. So he rejected that, and he had great persuasive powers. and he rejected those who were pressing these ideas. And he said, all you need is revelation, all you need is the Quran. If it doesn't fit with the Quran, then throw it out, burn it, whatever. And since you only need the Quran, you really don't need those other books either. That was called the really the closing of the Muslim mind. Robert Riley writes a fantastic book talking about that whole historical development, the closing of the Muslim mind, and that was in the 12th century. And that's why Islamic philosophy is so far behind, because they've really closed down and said all you need is the Quran. So a lot happened with those, but I think it was reflexive to what the Christians were bringing up and questioning.
So in other words, you're saying that faith and works discussion, the predestination, free will, the Quran being created, that's all particularly being discussed because now that they've conquered the Christians and the Jews, those that they've conquered are bringing up these theological questions and they're having to work it out in that environment.
Exactly. But it's because it's a reaction to what the Christians are bringing up. And it's also interesting that at that time, there were Christians who were asked to translate the works of Aristotle and Plato and other Greek philosophers into Arabic, because they knew Greek and they also knew Arabic. This is several hundred years after Islam starts up. And some of the Muslim thinkers started reading Aristotle, and they were amazed by that. They wrote some of the great commentaries at that time. And so they follow that idea of reason. And then you come to Al-Ghazali, who just rejected it. And because he was so persuasive and so powerful at that time, there was basically the closing of the Muslim mind. Revelation is all you need. Reason is something.
Is that Al-Ghazali's book, The Incoherence of the Philosophers?
Yes. Against, I think, Ibn Rushd, who was one who did follow reason and had pretty good philosophy, but he was rejected and by Al-Ghazali.
Yeah, and obviously within Christianity, we have our own discussion about reason and revelation, and that has a history within our tradition as well. And so the Muslims have to deal with that, and they've dealt with it, I guess, in slightly different ways. Although it's still no doubt a live issue for them. Well, look, I want to get on to chapter 6 now. We've discussed some of the background, and what I'd like to do now is to give you an opportunity to talk about the section in John's book on the heresy of the Ishmaelites, and particularly to talk about, you know, the arguments that he brings up in defending Christianity, and, you know, what were his observations of Islam, you know, those types of things, his arguments and his observations.
First, it is so important to have this from John of Damascus. We know when he lived, we know his position, we have his works. We have this book called The Heresy of the Ishmaelites. Actually, it is the last section of a list of or summary of 100 different heresies. It's in his book, Orthodox Faith, or Fountain of Knowledge, where he has the dialectics, which would be the philosophical section, talking about logic and how to use logic. The second part is usually the book of heresies, where he's basically copying earlier church fathers like Eusebius and others dealing with the heresies. But the last three were written by John, and the last one is the heresy of the Ishmaelites, where he's talking about the development of Islam. And in that book, he exposes what Islam is in his time. So he calls, he refers to Mahomet, not Muhammad. There is a difference. Mahomet, now we're finding, is perhaps a reference to a different type of leader rather than the one that the Muslims are pointing to. But he called Mahomet a false prophet very directly. He also said that this religion was a coercive religion that was of the Antichrist. Now, those are pretty strong words. At that time, you know, he served Abd Malik as the chief tax collector. He was in public service for a long time, but then he left. He became a priest and a monk, went to a monastery near Jerusalem. And so he was kind of isolated from the government. And that is where he did his writing. And he wrote, I think we have, we have a large number of his works. And it was in Greek, so the Muslims were not able to really read that. There were not many Muslims who read Greek at that time. And so he wrote this book on the heresy. He also knows of a few writings of that time. This is in the 740s. So think about this. Muhammad supposedly died in 732. He's writing this heresy, a book of heresies, in about 743. And he's mentioning Mahomet, coercive religion. And he mentions what we know now as some surahs. He doesn't call them surahs. He calls them different writings, as if they're different books, separate books. And he only knows really three of the ones that we would refer to. There would be surah number 4 on the women. He calls them women instead of the woman, I think, which is in the Quran. Surah 5, which is Al-Ma'idah, the table. And this is where it has the passage about Christ not being crucified, but it only appeared so. No, that's 4:157. This is the laying out of the table where
Surah 5.
That's Surah 5.
Yep.
Right. And then Surah 2 on the heifer, the camel, the heifer, Al-Baqarah. And that has a lot of the legal things. It was one of these were the later ones. These were called the Medinan surahs by others. But it's very curious that these are the only ones he had. Now, he put in another one called the camel, but we don't have that. He went on, his longest part of the treatise is focused on this camel. The camel that drinks up the river and drinks up all the milk, and it goes up to heaven and causes havoc and everything like that, and they want to kill them. You only find little bits and pieces of this in the Quran, but he has a whole section on that. So it seems likely that, and he was making fun of it. So it may have gotten back to those who were putting together the Quran. And this is why we feel that the Quran was not canonized even in the middle of the 8th century. But you have bits and pieces of this going around, perhaps because they knew at that time that they needed to have their own book, and so they were collecting it from different sources. But that's a different story.
So I just want people to understand what you've said. You said that because John gives us a historical snapshot before the written Islamic sources that we have, and he's interacting with the Muslim scriptures, we can actually see that he's interacting quite well because he gives the right names, he gives the right content. So he's obviously being very careful in what he's doing. But he talks about a chapter in the Quran called the camel, which is not a chapter in the Quran that we have today. And so you're saying here that this may well be an indication that there was a bit of fluidity with the Quran at this point, and there were, it still hadn't been canonized in the way that we see it today.
And he was also, when he quoted from these writings, they were not the canonical version that you find in the Quran. They were fluid, as you were saying. So this was probably an indication that the Quran was still fluid in the middle of the 8th century.
Okay.
And that's important.
Yeah. And so it's information like that you're saying scholars today are looking at and saying, hang on, we're getting a slightly different picture of what Islam was like before the Islamic sources. So we can look at historical sources before the Islamic sources, and they're telling us that the Muslims are there and that they've got these scriptures, but it's saying some other stuff that doesn't quite match up.
And what's interesting is that working with Jay Smith and some of the researchers, the Anata group from Germany and so on, we're finding a lot more of these pieces and how they fit together. For example, one thing that they're looking into is that perhaps these early Muslims, the Saracens, the Ishmaelites, who were mostly Arabs, but they were probably made up of Christians and Jews and this intermediate monotheism, which may have been mostly anti-Trinitarian. So that's why you have the writings on the Dome of the Rock, which we usually date at 691. Now that's even in dispute, but that's the earliest that you'd have the Muslim writing, and it talks about, say not three, do not say that Allah had a son. So there's this anti-Trinitarian part, but at the same time, even on the Dome of the Rock, when they mention Muhammad, it may have been in reference to Jesus Christ as the praised one, because Muhammad can be a title. All of these things are fluid at that time. And so John was capturing them, and we can get a better understanding from looking back at John of Damascus.
All right. Now, in his, I want to get back to his Heresy of the Ishmaelites.
Mm-hmm.
So he answers the charge of the Trinity, and that the Trinity being illogical, by referring to Jesus as the Word and the Spirit of God. And he answers the charge that Muslims bring of Christians of being people who associate things with God. How does John respond to that?
Well, it's interesting because the Quran does say that Jesus, as the Messiah, is the Word of Allah and the Spirit of Allah. It says that clearly. Most Muslims don't really understand the implications there, but John takes that further and says, wait a minute, if Jesus is the Word and the Spirit of Allah, and he was created, then that means that then Allah's Word and Spirit had to be created after. They were not eternal. And so John calls them mutilators. They call Christians associators because we want to associate Jesus with God. But John called them mutilators because they tore the Word and the Spirit away from God. So it was a good argument, and it was used for hundreds of years by his followers, his disciples.
Okay, so in other words, our doctrine of God is that God has his Spirit, God has his Word. And so for the Muslims to say that Jesus, who is the Word and the Spirit of Allah, is not eternal, is to chop away God's Spirit and God's Word from God, in God in eternity. And so John's saying that they're actually chopping God up, chopping pieces of God.
And another aspect of that, given the new research, is that this may have been an identification that the Quran was talking about Jesus as the Word, and that talking about Jesus as the Word, and that these other references to Muhammad, other references to the prophet as the main person, would have been actually references to Jesus. Again, that sense that they were, Christians or anti-Trinitarian Christians at that time. Okay.
Now, another charge that's brought against Christians is that they are idol worshippers because of how the Christians at John's time venerated the cross.
Mm-hmm.
And I know John wrote a book on in defense of icons, and I guess for many of us, we wouldn't be wanting to defend icons, but how did John respond to this charge that Christians, in his day were idolatrous because they venerated the cross?
Okay, a lot of this came because Leo III, who was the emperor of the Constantinople and the Byzantine Empire, really came down hard and wanted to have the church get rid of all these idols. it's very suspicious because that's what Islam was doing in that time, the early 700s. They were going around tearing down the crosses, bashing the statues, the idols, and the churches, and so on in the areas that they conquered. And so it seems like Leo was just picking that up and following along. But John said, "Wait a minute, we're not worshiping these icons. They are referring us to God. They're referring us to Christ. After all," and this was his important point that won the day, after all, God himself came in the flesh in the form of Jesus Christ to show us who he was. These icons are also now, because Christ is not here, just a way of reflecting and remembering and focusing not on the icon itself, but what it represented, pointing upward. And that kind of ameliorated the destruction of the iconoclasts.
Okay. So, yeah, I know that as, for Protestant Christians, we wouldn't have those icons. And so we may want to agree with Leo the Third a bit more at that point. Mm-hmm. Yeah. But doesn't John also respond in the Heresy of the Ishmaelites by talking about the black stone?
Yes, and this would probably refer to the stone that's there at the Kaaba in Mecca. It's a meteorite, and there's a long history that it may have started out earlier in Petra, stolen by Al-Zubair, a rival of Abd-al-Malik, and taken down to what is now Mecca. But John says, "Oh, you worship this stone, you kiss it. You may have even had Abraham tie his donkey up to it, and so on." So he's making fun of this stone because they're worshiping this stone, and yet they're totally against all these crosses and other icons. So he counters that.
Yes, and that is an interesting thing. If you read the hadiths, it talks about Muhammad's companions being very uncomfortable about kissing the stone and giving it honor, and using it as a means of seeking Allah's blessing. And while I don't support icons, it is rather hypocritical to be critical of Christians that do, when you've got the black stone, that if you see the videos, the Muslims get into a bit of a frenzy when they're trying to kiss it and get Allah's blessing from it. And so
very interesting.
Yeah, so John brings that up. Now, are there any other theological issues that he brings up in the Heresy of the Ishmaelites that you'd like to discuss?
Well, he does talk about some of the practices that they mention, and for example, they would talk about injunctions. They said that both men and women needed to be circumcised, and that's a big problem today because of the mutilation of so many women through all these 1400 years needlessly. They talk about not being baptized, not going to Sabbath worship, whether for the Jews or for the Christians, and not eating certain food that is forbidden, such as pork. So those were things that John brought up. So it shows that he knows what was going on. He knew what was going on.
Yeah.
And that gives us a window into that time period and an understanding of the development of Islam. The Quran was not completed. The theology was far from being completed. In fact, all those disputes came later. But he had an edge on knowing what was going on.
Okay. Now, the next book I want to look at is the Disputation between a Disputation between a Christian and a Saracen. And this is another writing from John. Can you tell us about the structure of this and how it functions?
It's an early dialogue. It's brilliant. And it's probably something that he wrote as a training manual. I don't think that he necessarily did this, but he's calling the Arab at this time the Saracen. In the other he called the heresy of the Ishmaelites. Both of those terms were used of these Arabs who later became Muslims following Islam. And in this book, he talks about some of these theological disputes. Let's see, the explanation of God's will, Christ as the Word of God. So he also picks up the same argument about the Word and the Spirit, gives it more depth, talks about God sending Christ into the world as his incarnation. So he talks about how that fits together. And he brings up other theological issues that oppose the Saracens at that time. So it's very much exposing what the Saracens would believe. So he gives this Saracen a hard time. He doesn't treat him very well, but he's trying to get a point across to the Christians. Be encouraged. These questions can be answered. And that's what you want to do in a training manual.
So it's very different to the heresy of the Ishmaelites, which is more of just like an essay that is written, you know, giving his details. In the disputation between a Christian and a Saracen, it's a series of questions and answers,
Yep.
And it's a training manual in that sense.
Yes, a dialogue that is worth reading through. It really helps you understand what was going on at that time.
Okay.
So he may have been having these dialogues. He probably did.
Yep. Now, I want us to move on now to the people who came after John and how they used his work. So, you know, was John influential? Did people continue his work and modify it and, you know, adapt it? You know, can you tell us about those who came after John?
Well, we have echoes of his Word of God and Spirit, referring to Jesus, for about 300 years after. So that was an argument that was picked up by apologists. But he also had disciples like Abu Qura, who was very instrumental later on because he knew Arabic. He used Arabic. He wrote in Arabic. So he was witnessing to the Muslims in their own language. John probably knew Arabic as well as Syriac and Greek. He wrote in Greek, which was the academic language and also the business language. And as chief tax collector, he would have used it all the time. But Abu Qura was one who used the arguments, developed the arguments, and he used a lot of the stuff that John had laid out. So you have Abu Qura and others in the 9th century, 10th century who would have used these arguments.
Okay. So I want to finish up now. How can John be a model to Christians today?
It's a very good question because we have so much confusion today, especially in regard to Islam. I think that what I picked up mostly from John was his technique of apologetics, working with a different religion, showing some respect, but some see him as a polemicist because he made fun of Muhammad, he made fun of some of the traditions and so on. But what I picked up are the 3 characteristic words that I mentioned earlier: understand, defend, and refute. We need to understand what we believe so that we can defend what we believe. But in order to do that too, we need to understand what Muslims believe. We need to read the Quran. We need to understand it. We need to read the Quran with a good commentary. And there is a great book, a great translation of the Quran with a Christian commentary, a Christian view of what's going on that would perhaps be easier to follow. But we need to do that in order to refute the error, because it's been so hard to do that today. And it's taken in a lot of Christians or those who have not been faithful or do not know much about God, and they've been taken in by Islam. So we need to be able to refute the error. And John did a great job of setting that up from the beginning, and we need to know what he had to say because, as I said, he was the first apologist to the Muslims. There were some who wrote about Islam or the developing religion before him, but he was the one who first, I think, he wrote the Orthodox faith, this compendium of theology summarizing 7 centuries of this great theology of the church fathers, because he wanted Christians to know what they believe. And then he wrote these treatises, the Heresy of the Ishmaelites, the dialogue between the Christian and the Saracen, so that they would be able to understand what the Muslims or the Ishmaelites at that time believed, and also have a training manual that they could use in answering those questions, or at least seeing how they could go about answering questions.
Okay, so he's a great example for making sure we understand our own faith properly, and then understanding who we're speaking to, and then having systems for how we present that. All right. Well, look, I want to thank you for writing this book, and thank you for your time today. And I do want to encourage people. I want to encourage Christians watching this in particular, 2 things. Firstly, I think what Daniel would like you to do is to read John of Damascus for yourself, to go and get him from the early church fathers, and not to let him gather dust, but to read John Damascus and what he writes about Islam, and let that be an encouragement. And in fact, you may want to read a lot more of what John's written, because as Daniel has said, he made a summary of the Christian faith very helpfully for us. So please track down John of Damascus and his writings. You'll be able to find him probably on the web or in libraries. And then, of course, I'd also like to encourage people who want to really delve into this further to read Daniel's book. It's excellent. I learned many things, and it made me think about some new areas in a very helpful way. So thanks again, Daniel. And
you're welcome.
We'll there. Thank you.
Thank you, Samuel. This was, I appreciate you taking the time.
Okay. Goodbye.
Bye.